Hey everyone, and welcome back to Amaranth Bay. Today we're continuing our Superior-inspired build with a big residential expansion to flesh out the town's grid and, of course, boost up our population. We're going to build a few different sorts of housing throughout the grid today, but we're going to start off with some of the historic houses right on the fringes of downtown. I think this is probably one of the best ways to get the classic look of an American downtown, to have a relatively small area of houses in the grid that just starts a couple blocks away from Main Street. So even though you're going to get some areas of downtown that develop in a more modern way, you're going to have some of these blocks demolished and replaced with new developments, but you'll generally have some area like this that remains and probably will remain for a long time. Of course, getting these blocks to look good is a whole different issue, and is definitely something that I've struggled with in the past. To me, it looks like Superior has a bit less of the kind of big, grand houses that you see in places like the East End in Duluth, and also quite a bit less of the brick infill that's kind of spread throughout the fringes of downtown in Duluth, as opposed to Superior. You do get some of that here and there, and we will be including those at some point in the build, but for the most part, I decided to tone those two parts down a little bit. And for most of the development, we're going to focus on these 1-unit width houses that have the sorts of silhouettes that you see in Superior, with these simple gables facing the street for the most part, although there are some varied ones here and there as well. I tried a few different sorts of patterns, so mostly you see houses that face the north-south streets with their backs against the alleys, but occasionally you do also see some lined up against the east-west streets. So primarily I'm going to go with the former, but then also occasionally use the latter just for a bit of variation. I did try to lean more into that technique on the streetcar streets because I figured that the streetcar would have been something that would have constantly drawn development over the years, all the way from the opening of the streetcar lines up to present day. Occasionally you see a row of several homes that look quite similar. I'm not an expert, but that to me looks like a more recent development than some of the others that came back and used old abandoned lots to build new housing in a somewhat similar style, but kind of with those little giveaways that it's more modern development. I could be wrong about that, but that's just my thought process there. So I did try to include those kinds of things occasionally. I did find that it was pretty easy to overdo that sort of pattern, so I didn't use it too much, but I think having it here and there just gives that little bit of variation. In general, I think the most important way to get the look I was going for was to have the houses fairly close together, and then later on, I'm going to come back and trim out some of the density to represent lots that have been abandoned and then have either been absorbed by their neighbors to make for a nice big lawn, I guess, or they've been taken over by new houses, or they've just remained abandoned. It does happen sometimes. You don't actually see that too much in Superior. It's not like suburban Detroit or anything like that. I'm not trying to hate on Detroit. I think it's a cool city, but there are lots of empty lots in the suburbs. But I do think it's prominent enough that playing it up just a little bit will kind of help sell that effect. Finally, there are a couple of details to flesh out these blocks. First being a whole bunch of detached garages, which I believe are generally later additions to older houses, and of course some trees as well. Which, as usual, I'm going to overdo them, and then I'm going to come back off camera and trim them down a little bit, so to speak. This neighborhood didn't come out quite the way I imagined it, so we are going to come back in a bit and clean it up and then use it as a template to make a really big expansion out into the remainder of the grid. But first, I wanted to build a couple of fun points of interest and a couple of other types of housing that are going to break up the monotony of the single-family homes and maybe point to a little bit of the history of this town. The first point of interest is going to be built in two parts. So you have a public housing block, and then attached to that is a community center and also a public housing office. I'm going to start with the office. I used this modular set of school buildings. Just like I mentioned back in the industrial zone build, this set can really be useful for any kind of civic building built basically anytime from the end of World War II up until today. It's not just useful for building schools, although it of course does work for that purpose as well. I like this spot here for it because you have a major avenue on one side, and then on the other side you have the streetcar line. So I think it makes sense that a development like this would be positioned here instead of some random spot in the middle of a sea of low density housing, although I suppose that could work as well if you wanted to. Around back, you have the community center, which is just another one of these generic buildings. Not too much to say here, just a little bit of detailing around the exterior to try to make it look civic and inviting, I guess. And then, of course, in the middle, to fill out the remainder of the block, we have a nice little parking lot. Because these are just school buildings, I'm going to add in some functionality using a couple of different things. So you have an office block clipped into the office, of course, and then an entertainment block for the community center, which is basically, that just functions as a park, so it'll draw some people here and make it an attraction of sorts. For the housing development itself, it seems like they took the grid and modified it just a little bit, which I assume is to make it a little bit more isolated so you don't have people using their essentially private roads and parking lots as through roads. So I did something like that by placing these one-lane, one-way roads, which have parking on one side, where the alleys would have been, and then removing a couple of the crossroads. So you have this sort of system that it's very easy to use if you want to enter this area or exit it and you're a local, but if you want to use it as a through road, it's just not worth figuring out how to navigate it. For the apartments themselves, I wanted to squeeze in 2 per half block tile, just like the one in real life. So I needed a very skinny asset for this, and these public housing units from Omaha by Daniel work very nicely for that. They do end up looking a little bit cramped still, but I suppose that's not that unrealistic. To connect them up, I used this suitably tiny 2-wide pedestrian path. I think it's 2 wide, it might be 1 wide. And I have those running between the buildings, and then I also use the matching set of decals in a wider version to attach the front and rear entrances of the houses to the paths in the middle and the sidewalks on the exterior. Because there was a little bit of dead space here and you have a couple of buildings without direct access to parking, I decided to slot in a little parking lot here. So that should have everyone nice and satisfied. I don't know why I didn't just run the road through here, but oh well, it doesn't really matter. Finally, this little corner over here with some empty space is going to get a tiny playground. We're going to build a nearby park in a bit, so this really isn't meant to be the main green space for people who live here. It's really just a secondary point that's a bit more convenient, so you could use this kind of during the day. And then if you wanted to kind of enjoy nature a little bit more, you could go over to the park. Anyway, across the street, we are going to locate a couple of iconic buildings that are going to add a bit, a little something to the town skyline. What that something is, I don't know, but I'll leave that up to you to judge, I guess. First, you have this tower, which is based on Superior's old city hall, which I think is kind of an interesting little specimen because there's really not much other development in the vicinity other than single-family homes and maybe a couple of older shops. And I feel like that just sort of evokes some of the history of the town. In our case, there are going to be some things nearby that kind of make sense why it would be here, but we'll get to that in a bit. Of course, these days, just like in Superior, it is no longer functioning as the actual city hall. That's going to be elsewhere. Haven't figured out where yet. And it's being used as a private office building that maybe has a few commercial businesses inside as well. And just like everything else in town, it's going to get a nice parking lot around back. And the rest of the block just got fleshed out with a couple more historic buildings as well. The next iconic building just across the street is inspired by this cathedral in Superior, which I think is kind of interesting because it has almost like a Spanish revival style to it. I don't know if that's the proper term, but that's what it looks like to me. I didn't look too much into the history there, and I didn't want to necessarily go that route in our build. I wanted to use something that blends in a little bit more with the environment. So instead, I used this very nice asset, which is called Boomkirk, so I kind of had to install it because that's just a great name. And I think the brick look kind of fits into the environment. I don't know what it is about all these Dutch assets that seem to fit in to early 20th century northern Minnesota cities, but Wisconsin. This is in Wisconsin. So I don't know what it is about that, but I think it just fits in nicely. To blend it in a little bit, I'm going to add a little pathway system around the exterior. That's going to connect everything up to the sidewalk, so you could almost treat these grounds as like a park, which I think is kind of nice. And on the other side, we're going to have some of that beautiful nature had been replaced at some point with a parking lot. This was a bit of an awkward shape to build a parking lot in, so I just used the ploppable asphalt method along with some parking spot decals. So I didn't bother using networks and trying to make it overly functional. There's also this little building to the side. I have no idea what purpose this serves, but I do feel like it adds a nice little balance to the block, especially once you get the trees down in this little landscaped area. We're going to continue drawing from all over Superior, and this time we're going to look at the railway station. The motivation behind having all this development around this location, which is kind of at a bit of a remove from the main development of downtown along Main Street, is that there is a historic railway station here. So you can imagine that there would have been historic development along here, and in our universe at least, they continue to use this, so there would be a modern development here as well. In our case, it's just going to be a single stop on our scenic railway. So of course you already have this stop here over at Union Station in downtown, and previously it would have just continued over along the shoreline so you could get the nice views of Lake Superior. But now we're going to add an initial stop over in this new town, which I still haven't decided the name of, so I'll have to do a poll or something about that, and we can get that set up so I can stop whining about that while I'm doing these recordings. I think this is kind of a nice addition to the rail line because it allows the train to pass over the old swing bridge, which I imagine would be very attractive to people who want to take a scenic train ride. And then it also passes through the industrial zone, which again, you can see all this old historic infrastructure, which is kind of one of the big appeals of a city like this. Moving back to the station itself, you have a new parking lot, of course, which is accessed by these old remnants of the grid on either side that used to cross this double rail line. So at some point they would have removed some of these cross streets to just allow for fewer level crossings. I did block traffic from using these roads beyond the parking lot, and we'll add some details in a moment to represent that blockage. Before that, I focused on detailing the exterior of the station. I basically wanted the immediate vicinity to be more historic and inviting. So you have this nice tiled floor and some seating out front. Because the station would be an attraction in itself as much as it would be an access point for the scenic railway. So I wanted it to look at least somewhat nice on the exterior. And then of course the bits on the side over here where you're not going to get visitors, they've been molded a little bit more to fit the car. So you have a little parking area over on one side, and then you have a little kind of delivery area over on the other side. So while I was building this, the train pulled up, and one issue I found is that it is much longer than the platform because I had kind of compressed the platform to fit into a single city block. So I decided to do something, at least it seems a little bit weird to me, and add basically a paved platform out in the next block over to cover the remaining cars. So you could imagine that if you needed to have people board over here instead of all getting on the same car at the platform, you could bring out some stairs or ramps or whatever they do in this situation to make up for the lack of elevated platform. I have no idea if this sort of setup is at all realistic, but even if it isn't, I think it kind of points to the secondary nature of rail infrastructure in the modern day, even though it's something that I've sort of tried to play up quite a bit in this series. So with the railway station done, we had this block across the street remaining. I thought this would be a good spot to sort of bring everything together and make it feel like a slightly more central and historic part by building a park. It's just going to be a very simple layout with an X-shaped path that has this one little adjustment over here to directly access the streetcar stop. I think this is sort of nice because if you wanted to take the streetcar to access the station or the sightseeing rail line, and who would not want to do that, right? Then you could do that and walk through this park to get there. The rest of it is very straightforward, just with some basic amenities and a nice collection of old trees, mostly these classic live oak trees, which I think work really nicely in this kind of Midwestern park. I was going to give it a custom name, but the default one was kind of a little bit too good to change. I don't know if there are any Law Dispute fans out there, but if there are, you might recognize this and understand why I didn't want to change it. It's got to be at least one of you. And finally, I added some crosswalks so people can actually cross the street semi-safely after passing through the park to get here. Most of the remainder of the grid is going to get the same low-density housing treatment that the first bit did, but first I wanted to head over to the other side of town and add in a couple of additional iconic builds that I think will give a bit of balance to downtown and just give us an additional area to develop. First, I'm going to build another public housing development, very loosely inspired by these apartments in Superior. I don't know if these are public housing or if they're just private apartments or what. Our version is going to be a little bit different. So you still have the curve of the avenue here on one side, but it's not sticking out off the side of the grid like in real life. It's more enclosed by the grid on the other side. And that's going to make sense why I did that in a little bit when we add some additional things around here. As a result, it's a little bit more cramped. So the road network for it ends up being kind of boring. It's really just this little C shape and then a little cross parking lot to flesh out the remaining area. And that's going to allow all these apartments to get nice and cozy in here. The whole thing is going to be detailed pretty much the exact same as the first one, with a path system and a very light sprinkling of trees, which I did pare down a little bit. Next to these apartments, I thought it would make sense to build a nice big park because there's really not going to be much space to do this sort of thing over here once we get the low density houses plopped down. For that, I'm going to take inspiration from this one in Superior, which drew my eye because it seems like some of the grid was trimmed away to make room for it. And that's just something that I think is kind of fun to do. So I'm going to do something similar to that road network here to allow for a nice positioning between the north-south streetcar avenue over on the left and the apartment complex over on the right. I used this gravel planter to try to represent the gravel that you sometimes see at playgrounds. I didn't know if this quite worked, but I ended up sticking with it because I didn't feel like replacing it. Nearby, I put down some of the smaller amenities for the park, like a picnic pavilion, which has a little chimney built in, which is kind of cool, so you could go in there and build a fire, I guess. And there's also a single basketball court. I feel like I probably should have added more of those, but that's fine. The main parking lot is down here, partly to provide easy access to the avenue because it's right up against the streetcar avenue, but also because the remaining blocks are going to need to preserve a lot more space for the larger things that are going to go over there. So I wanted to locate the main parking lot here. Then in this remaining spot up top, I'm going to build a hockey rink using the exact same technique from a few episodes ago. I forget exactly which one that was, but it's basically just a network made into a pill shape, covered in asphalt and some decals, and then the kind of wooden barrier or whatever it's called is added in with IMT. This part is pretty car-centric so far with the massive parking lot, so I'm going to start the pedestrian path network to connect up all these various bits and just try to make it a little bit more accessible for humans. We're going to carry that network over into the larger portion of the park down and to the right in a moment. But before we get to that, I wanted to quickly detail up the parking lot. Like with the cathedral from before, it's not going to be a fully functional lot because these sorts of lots really aren't too full unless there's a big event going on, at least not in my experience. So they're just going to be a few people parked here permanently, I guess, because they're just props. The rest of the park is going to consist of this baseball diamond, which I rotated this way to try to minimize the number of stray baseballs being hit out of the park and into people's windows, I guess. This thing is going to get its own parking lot, so I apologize for that. But I just figured that, you know, if you had like a baseball game or whatever, you'd probably want people to be able to park there. It's not like there's tons of free street parking around here or anything. It's not a functional or full parking lot, although you do have this RV over here, which I suppose could be the park's caretaker. Sometimes you have arrangements like that where the caretaker can live on the grounds as long as they're, you know, doing the job. I suppose it could also be a meth lab. Next door to that, you have a football field, which also doubles as a soccer field, which is also known as a football field, depending on where you are. Usually, in this case, in real life, you'll get both sets of markings painted onto the field, so you can use it for either game. But because this prop doesn't seem to like decals on top of it, I wasn't able to replicate that look, so we're just going to get the good old gridiron. I don't think you usually get a full painted football field like this outside of like schools or like city stadium sort of things. But I'm thinking that maybe it could be used by a local school, which we're not going to get to building this episode, but there'll be some sort of nearby school at some point. Or maybe like a local sports club sort of thing, I guess. Either way, it's going to be connected up to the path system, like I mentioned before, which in turn will get connected up to the road network. For a little bit of functionality here, I'm going to add an invisible park life park entrance, and I'm just going to clip that into one of these generic buildings. So the park in real life is named Wade Bowl Park. I couldn't find any details on the namesake for that. I assume that there was some guy with the name Wade Bowl, but since I couldn't find any references about that, I decided to just riff on it a little bit, and I called it the Doug E. Bowl Park, which is really dumb, but that's never stopped me before. So of course I also added in a whole bunch of trees. You have some thicker growths along the edges just to isolate it a little bit more and make it feel a bit more natural. And then there are some more park-like plantings kind of around the playground area. Pretty sure someone is running a wood chipper outside. I wanted the area around this park to be a bit more built up, which I think is going to pair nicely with some of the commercial developments along the avenue that turns into a strode, which is going to be coming in a future video. But I feel like that it's going to make sense to have some of these more modern developments kind of stem from that area and trickle down into the area around the park. Trickle down urbanism. So for this episode, we're mostly going to focus on the residential aspect of that. We'll start with this apartment building that takes up the remaining half of the block here next to the park. I think this is kind of an interesting arrangement because the obvious thing to do would just be to have the entire thing taken up by the park. But I think having these sorts of half blocks add a little bit of contrast and also reflect the slight breakdown of the grid that you seem to get with these more modern builds, kind of like with the first public housing development where they repurposed the grid into a more insular road network without really making too many changes overall. I like building these sorts of apartments for a bit of a change of pace because they bring a really nice population boost, and they're also relatively fun and easy to build in detail compared to a similarly sized lot of houses. So in this case, for the details, we just have a very simple parking lot around back, just with a single row of parking spots. And then out front, I made a little pull-through area. I'm thinking maybe in the future we'll add a bus stop here, but for now it's just a little drop-off kind of area. I just made that using some pavement lines and grass fillers in IMT, and then of course banning parking in the filled in areas so you don't get cars stuck in the grass, which would be funny, but not very realistic. On the other side of the park, along the streetcar avenue, we have a slightly older looking apartment that probably would have been built on top of some abandoned lots and also the alley that used to run through the middle of this block. So they ripped up the alley and built their driveway on top of it to access the apartment's parking area. I'm not going to bore you with these parking spots. So in the other half of the block, you have this big brick apartment building, which I'm thinking would be quite a bit older and maybe would have been built around the time of the addition of the streetcar line here, almost as a kind of old school transit-oriented development. In fact, I think that's actually going to provide the explanation for why there's this additional cluster of development over here. So you got a few buildings like this one that sprung up at the time of the arrival of the streetcar, but it never formed into a fully developed avenue like Main Street where you get all this wall-to-wall development, and that's going to explain why most of the area around here was built up with single-family homes, despite having some of these clusters of more dense development. That in turn is going to explain why there's been a resurgence of development here in the form of kind of these more modern apartments, along with some commercial buildings that we're going to put down in a bit, long after the completion of this brick complex here. So basically, all of this development at one point or another was motivated by the presence of the streetcar line. So props to the new town for not ripping up their streetcar line. There is going to be one more modern apartment complex here, which has kind of a convoluted parking lot in the middle, but really there's not too much to say about that. Like I mentioned before, the area up here is going to get its own Strode episode. Strodisode, if you will. But for now, I wanted to flesh out the remaining area along the streetcar line. This area is mostly going to consist of single-family homes, but there is going to be a small, more modern commercial area as well, kind of like we had at the southern end of Main Street last episode. This time, instead of a bank and gas station serving travelers on the highway, we're going to get a hotel and a gas station. So it's a big difference. Okay, now to finish off the residential expansion, let's go back to those single-family homes from the beginning of the video. Like I said, I wasn't perfectly happy with how these looked, so before placing down even more of them, I wanted to fix them up a little bit. They're not going to be perfect still, but I think that they're going to feel a bit more realistic, hopefully. The roads feel quite bare as they are, so the first thing to do is add some street trees. These seem to be quite varied in placement and type and size and all that in real life. So I don't think that using the built-in street tree function that you have in network skins would be ideal here. So instead, I'm going to add them in manually. I just made a little collection of trees that I thought would look nice in this context, and I cycled through them using the randomizer function in Find It. They're mostly quite small, but I did want to have a few kind of bigger, grander looking ones, but I tried to keep them a little bit more rare so they feel older and more special. Another thing that I wanted to adjust was the relation of each house to the street that it faces. The facades of the house in any given block in Superior tend to be at about the same distance from the road, more or less, so I wanted to try to line most of them up and also push them back as far as possible to create some larger front yards so that the space up against the streets doesn't feel too cramped. The big problem with this is that, well, first, it's tedious and unfun. And second, it pushes back the built-in paths and driveways that are baked into these assets, or they're not baked in, but they're props that are kind of built into the spawned building. And I have to come back and manually plop down some decals to bring those all the way back up to the road. Usually they do cross the sidewalk onto the grass strip so that if you're parked on the street, you can step directly onto the pathway. I was a little hesitant to include so many driveways here along the main roads because most of these houses would have been built quite a ways before the proliferation of the car, but it does seem like a good number of houses in real life have added these in at some point in the last century. So I'm going to leave them be. We do end up getting quite a few more here than we do in Superior, but I just don't have it in me to micromanage the number of driveways in my town. So even though the character of the grass that you get in real life looks very consistent from the satellite view, when you get closer, the texture and the color really does seem to vary in between the different properties. This makes sense, I think, given all the various factors that can affect what grass looks like. It's not really a topic I know or care that much about. So suffice it to say that when you get these larger lots or some of these empty lots, I just decided to plop down some different sorts of grass decals to evoke the different look of the grass, hopefully without making it stand out too much, so you still get that overall cohesive look looking at it from a distance, but not so much that it just looks like we're plopping all of these houses down onto an identical swath of grass texture, which is exactly what we're doing. But, some of the other smaller things that I took care of on this pass were adjusting the positions and colors of the garage props to make more sense with the houses they're attached to. So I tried to match the roof color with the color of the house for the ones that have adjustable roof colors, and the siding color for the ones that have adjustable siding color. And that's just going to make everything feel a little bit more cohesive and less colorful and exciting. It's going to look better. I also tried to remove some of these trees for a bit more of an open feeling, which is kind of painful for me to remove trees, but I tried to. I also duked a few houses here and there in order to free up some of those lots for the aforementioned reasons. So even with all the stuff we've built, there's still a lot of grid left to fill in. I couldn't bring myself to manually place down every single house here. So instead, we're just going to copy and paste all of these curated blocks and hope that it doesn't look too repetitive. You'd think that copying 14 by 12 blocks of houses into identical 14 by 12 blocks would be pretty straightforward, but apparently it can still result in some weird placements. I think it has something to do with the widths of some of these more major avenues. So I did end up having to adjust some of these so that all the paths and driveways are properly aligned with the roads. But for the most part, doing it this way saved me a whole lot of time, and I think that the results look essentially the same as if I had spent 10 hours manually plopping everything. Not that I'm opposed to doing that, but if I don't have to, I'd rather not. So I'm pretty happy with how this neighborhood looks, although it does feel kind of weirdly isolated with all this empty, identical green texture around it. So I'm sure that over the next few episodes, we're going to get to filling all that in nicely and making everything look a little bit more realistic and cool. Is the rail line crooked here? It kind of looks crooked. Thank you to my channel members, with a special shout out to my $5 tier members, Juki, New, Peter J, and Victor Sellin. And of course, thank you for watching. See ya!